Welcome to another episode of Crops TV. My name is Megan Anderson. I'm an extension field agronomist with Iowa State University, and today I'd like to tell you a little bit about a new weed to Iowa, Asian copperleaf. So let's get the scoop on Asian copperleaf. Today we'll talk a little bit about its background, where it originates from, some identification and history information, and then talk about some lookalike species and management information. Asian copperleaf was first found in Iowa in 2016 in Blackhawk County, and since being found in Blackhawk County, it's been found in numerous other counties across the state, totaling 8 now, including primarily counties kind of in the Highway 20 corridor, like other counties like Grundy, Humboldt County. We also see it in Calhoun, Franklin, Wright, Hardin, and now Boone County in central Iowa as well. Many of these fields aren't discovered until the field is being harvested, and farmers notice basically a carpet of green material underneath the canopy. But occasionally we do get images like the picture on the left here of this field, basically with a carpet of Asian copperleaf prior to the post-emergence application. We don't know very much about the history of it in Iowa when it's been found in fields. Obviously, farmers have usually seen it for several years before they've told us about it, but there isn't really any sort of key thread that links all of these fields together. Some of the fields have a history of seed corn. Some of the fields have a history of having manure or other unusual fertilizer products applied to them. And then several either have or are near fields that have a cover crop history, but none of them have all of these things. And in the 8 counties that we found it in, we don't have any single thread that ties all of these individual cases together. So it's a bit of an unusual find so far. So here's an updated map that as of today, here in early 2025, these are the 8 counties that we have found this species in so far. Right now, I'd like to cut to some video that I took in the summer of 2024 in order to talk a little bit more about where this species originates from. The biggest question that a lot of people have had is, where did this plant come from? And we know it originates from Asia, particularly parts of China, and these, as far as I'm aware, would be areas that maybe would be soybean producing regions. So it can be a problem in soybean, where it originates from, as well as other crops like in orchards. And we know that there are some herbicide resistances that are present in populations in its native region. But it has since expanded to different areas, the western parts of Asia, I believe Australia, as well as maybe parts of Europe. And this is the first case. These fields that we found in Iowa are the first cases in the United States where we're aware of its presence in row crops. And so the only other places that we are aware of it showing up has been in horticultural areas. It was found on the initial spot it was found was the Long Island area of New York City. And so we have very little information as to how it ended up here and why it seems to be showing up in such massive numbers in some corn and soybean fields in Iowa, but none of our neighboring states, none of my colleagues in weed science or in other areas of the Midwest have found it anywhere thus far. And so there's very little that we know about where it came from or how it got here, but we are pursuing a lot of avenues as to where it might have come from, because it's likely that it had to have come in something that ended up in these crop fields, whether it be a feed source that somebody used with livestock and then manure ended up on fields, or whether it ended up with seed of some sort. These are all questions that I think we all have. They're the things that keep me up at night, I think. Since we know very little about this species in Iowa crops, we've used some other sources to try to determine what kind of risk it might pose to us and to Iowa farms. While it's not nearly as competitive as many of the weed species that we deal with in Iowa, like things like water hemp and giant ragweed, we do have a number of concerns about this species showing up in Iowa. In 2012, the USDA did a risk assessment on this species and found that it could be a weedy species of numerous crops and that the United States was suitable for establishment. But there was still a lot of question as to how invasive the species could be and what potential risk it posed to crop producers across the US. It does have some known herbicide resistances that we can find in literature from the areas that it originates from primarily. So, talking about China is where most of these have been documented, and they've either been documented in soybean or in orchard production. So those herbicide resistances are herbicide group 2, herbicide group 9, herbicide group 14, and herbicide group 22. And obviously, 3 of these groups are very commonly used in Iowa corn and soybean production, and 2 of them are important post-emergence options that we might use in either corn or soybean, glyphosate and fomesafen, in order to actually try to control things like water hemp. And so it is a little concerning to me, especially that we do see these resistances in its area of origin already. In order to talk about some of the identification of this species, I'd like to show you a little bit more video from the field. We are standing in a soybean field here in Boone County. Actually, we have a couple soybean fields right across the road from each other, and both of these fields have an infestation of this relatively new weed, Asian copperleaf. And so this is a pretty good scenario for what we get alerted to when farmers are finding it in their fields, right? Oftentimes it's mistaken for water hemp, or it's just some plant that hangs out under the soybean canopy that nobody can identify. And we're getting more and more finds, more and more calls from farmers where they are alerting us to the fact that they have this weed. And this is a really good example of what it might look like, because typically we get called about it at the end of the growing season when we pull the soybeans or the corn out of the field, and it will just be an absolute carpet of this Asian copperleaf, these plants. And you can see here in this open spot right along the edge of this soybean field, we have a pretty substantial population of it. This field actually received 2 post-emergence herbicide applications after the soybeans were up. The most recent one was probably 2 or so weeks ago, and you can see how much more Asian copperleaf has emerged since that application timing, even so much as having some, brand new cotyledon stage ones right now, and then we've got a few that already have several leaves and are kind of branched in this area as well. And for the most part, this species, it doesn't get very big. We're talking maybe 18 to 24 or so inches. It could be maybe a little taller along the edges of fields or the edges of waterways, but it mostly is hanging out underneath crop canopies, emerging very long duration during the growing season. I would sort of equate it preliminarily similarly to water hemp, right? Starts emerging in maybe early to mid-May, it seems like. At least this year, that's what happened. And it appears to still be emerging now. So very, very long emergence time frame on this species. But it appears that we're getting okay control of it with herbicides. In this particular case, in this field, it's just that obviously it continues to emerge and there's open canopy after we have cut off our post-emergence herbicide applications for the season. And so one of the early things is that Asian copperleaf has these very obvious round cotyledons. And so that's these first leaves that come out, and they actually look, I would say, more similar to like a velvet leaf than they would water hemp. Water hemp is going to have a long, skinny cotyledon shape that sticks out, and that's going to be the first clear sign that you're dealing with something other than water hemp early. And then this first set of, I'd call them kind of the first set of true leaves outside of these cotyledons, are opposite across the stem from each other. As soon as water hemp starts producing leaves, water hemp is producing leaves that are alternating in leaf arrangement. So you can think of those kind of like on a soybean plant here, where we have one leaf coming off at every node on the soybean plant. So just as an example, you can see there's one leaf coming off here and one leaf there and one leaf here. And so this is an alternating leaf arrangement, similar to what water hemp is going to have, whereas this copperleaf is going to have, well, not always opposite, but those early leaves are going to be opposite, and then it looks like later leaves become this alternate leaf arrangement. And so down here you can see these are those first leaves, those cotyledons, and then that first set of true leaves right here, those leaves are opposite, and then subsequent leaves appear to be alternate. But that's a pretty good early sign that you're dealing with something that's not water hemp. And then as these plants get bigger, I think they get easier to tell apart. But the last big thing that I would say that's really obvious is along the margin of these leaves of the copperleaf, they have these really blunt teeth. And water hemp is going to have what we would call a smooth or an entire leaf margin. It's not going to have any of the teeth along the leaf margins like the copperleaf has. And so you can see this is a pretty branched little copperleaf plant for only being maybe 3 to 4 inches tall. And it's actually already starting to produce flowers here. And so one of the signs that we're dealing with an Asian copperleaf is that as these get bigger, it's going to become more obvious, but they produce this bract, which is a modified leaf that's associated only with flowers. And that bract is going to be sort of circular to heart shape, and it will have this toothed margin along the edge of it on the bigger ones. And it looks much different than other copperleaf species that we have here in Iowa. And so there are other copperleaves that would have really similar looking leaves, similar looking early stage plants, but when it comes to differentiating them, aside from the fact that this copperleaf is the only one that we know to make these serious carpets of seedlings out in crop fields, the true way to differentiate them is to see them when they flower and look for those bracts. So on our other copperleafs that we find here in Iowa, we have bracts that I would equate them more like a hand. They have large teeth. They can have something like maybe 5 to 12 or 15 teeth that surround the flower, and it's just a modified leaf that's associated only with those flowers. So hopefully you got some good information out of that video from the field and can really see what it looks like when it does show up in Iowa crop fields. I would like to review some of the quick ID features that we talked about in the video before we move on. So this species is an annual species in the spurge or Euphorbiaceae family. Many spurges produce a milky sap, but the copperleafs actually do not. So if you split the stem, it won't have that milky sap. These are generally small plants. They don't typically grow much more than a couple feet tall, maybe up to 2.5 feet tall. When they are under a crop canopy, they are typically going to be much smaller. They do produce an ovate type shaped leaf, sort of like an elongated egg, with a toothed leaf margin. And then the first set of leaves is opposite, and subsequent leaves are going to have alternate leaf arrangement. That's a really key identifying feature looking at these leaves when you're trying to tell the difference between Asian copperleaf and another common weed in Iowa crop fields, water hemp. It is quite shade tolerant. We see this species underneath crop canopies regularly, and it will produce seed much like water hemp species will underneath crop canopies. The most important thing when we are trying to actually identify the species in the field is to look for these structures, these leaf structures that are associated with the flowers called bracts. And so in the case of Asian copperleaf, you can see in these pictures, it produces these sort of cup or heart-shaped bracts right underneath the flowers and the seed that are, they have those sort of like loosely toothed margins, right? Very short teeth around the outer edge of those bracts. And they importantly don't have any big dentations along them that would make them look like fingers. And so I just want to show you a couple more pictures of what that might look like. And so here's one. You can really see that heart shape in that image on the left. We do have other copperleaf species here in Iowa that you may run into, but typically not in crop fields. And so one of those species is going to be Virginia copperleaf. And so as you can see from this picture, it looks very similar to what the Asian copperleaf looks like. From the leaf shape perspective, it has the same teeth around the leaf margins and the same kind of leaf arrangement. That's why we really need those floral structures and those bracts that are associated with flowers to identify them, because in the case of Virginia copperleaf, it's going to have very deep dentations along the outside uh, of that bract. The bracts are also typically going to be hairy on the Virginia copperleaf. Another common copperleaf species that we might run into is called rhomboid copperleaf. I've heard many people refer to this as three-seeded Mercury as well. And then there's several others. But again, the common thread with all these other copperleafs that we are seeing is that they have these very deep dentations along the outside of those bracts. So they're really more like lobes, and they look kind of like hands grasping the bottom of those flowers as opposed to being the heart shape that Asian copperleaf has. The final species of copperleaf that we might run into in Iowa, and we may actually see this one in crop fields, is called hop hornbeam copperleaf. It's a heck of a mouthful. So this is another species that is actually, it can be quite weedy, and this one is known to show up in crop fields, typically more in southern states, but I have received images of it in Iowa soybean fields. This one typically has a more round leaf shape. It does look just slightly different from these other copperleafs like the Asian copperleaf. But again, when we see it flower, it has those very clear, almost lobes around the outside of those bracts that make it look like a hand is grasping the bottom of the flower. And so here's just another image of these kind of deeply lobed bracts that we might see that's more typical of like the Virginia copperleaf and the rhomboid copperleaf and the hop hornbeam copperleaf that's on the left, compared with what we notice when we see the bracts on the Asian copperleaf, which is more of a heart shape or kind of a cup that's sort of holding underneath those flowers. We do have other species that when you see Asian copperleaf pretty early in the field, might be mistaken for it. Probably the biggest one that we might see somebody mistake Asian copperleaf for early is going to be velvet leaf. And that's because Asian copperleaf has these very clear round cotyledons when it comes out of the ground. And then you could see here, we've got water hemp for comparison with these long, skinny cotyledons. So when you catch it really early, it's going to be hard to mistake that species for water hemp. But right there in the middle, we do have a velvet leaf. And so you can see those large, round cotyledons on the velvet leaf and how somebody might kind of second guess whether or not something is velvet leaf or is Asian copperleaf. When they start to put on a few more leaves, it does get kind of difficult to tell water hemp from Asian copperleaf, and you could easily see why somebody might mistake an Asian copperleaf in the field and just think it's another water hemp because it's very difficult to tell those two apart early. They both have a little bit of a reddish color on those leaves, but really you have to look at that first set of leaves that come out, those cotyledons, and then once they get a little bit of size on them, you will be able to tell the difference because water hemp is going to have alternate leaf arrangement on all of its leaves, whereas that Asian copperleaf, the first set of leaves are going to be opposite. Another lookalike I would say is prickly sida. This is something that I'm seeing much more commonly, primarily along the edges of crop fields where they get a little bit more sunlight and those populations are more obvious. But prickly sida has these really elongated, almost a lanceolate shaped leaf with those deeply toothed margins along the edge. And so you could see how somebody might mistake it for the copperleaf, but it's got much skinnier leaves. And it's going to look different when it flowers. Prickly sida is in the mallow family, and so it actually produces kind of a really pretty obvious flower that's going to look fairly yellow, compared with the Asian copperleaf that will have really nondescript flowers on it, and it'll have those big bracts underneath them. For our final lookalike, I'd like to show you another clip from the field where I was actually able to capture another Euphorbiaceae or spurge species that we might run into in crop fields so that we can compare that species with Asian copperleaf. In my left hand right here is the Asian copperleaf, and in my right hand right here is actually another Euphorbiaceae or spurge species called tooth spurge. And I actually just got a picture of this, right? We're right here in the middle of July. Got a picture of this actually in the last couple days. of somebody wondering if it was Asian copperleaf. And so you can see there's a bit of a color difference. Sometimes color differences are not the best way to tell species apart. They both have these toothed leaf margins on them, but tooth spurge, being a more typical euphorbia, is actually one that if I pull it apart, right, it is going to produce this milky sap. And so that's a good way until they flower. The flowers on this tooth spurge are going to look quite a bit different, much more like a poinsettia than like the Asian copperleaf. But you can see that milky sap there. And then again, if I pull the Asian copperleaf apart, we've got no milky sap on that one. Just to wrap up this identification section, why is identification important? Well, like I said earlier, we don't really know what kind of risk this poses to Iowa crop production. You can see here an image from a soybean field. This is fairly close to the edge of a field near a waterway. And at harvest, or very close to harvest here, there is a really, really thick population of this Asian copperleaf in the field. Did it affect yield in the field? I'm not certain. There's a lot we don't know about this, but certainly any species that's allowed to produce this many plants and will produce that many seed that you'll have to deal with in a future year could be a concern for us. Identifying these populations of Asian copperleaf early also allows us to monitor management successes and help us make better recommendations moving into the future. And it also helps us potentially contain these infestations. If this is going to be a big problem for Iowa crops, we'd really like to avoid getting it in as many fields as possible. Now I'd like to move on a little bit to management. What are the herbicide options for this species? Again, there's a lot of things that we don't know, but because a relative of it, hophorn beam copperleaf, is a row crop issue, it does show up on some herbicide labels, and there is a limited amount of information on what kinds of herbicides might work well against it. For example, some of the recommendations for residuals that we might want to use against hophorn beam copperleaf include active ingredients like sulfentrazone, metribuzin, and chloranthalum methyl. There's multiple post options that we might be able to use to control it. One of the challenges of the Asian copperleaf, much like water hemp, is that it very quickly produces numerous branches, as you can see in this picture. So you can see, even though that plant isn't much more than maybe 5 or 6 inches tall, it has several branches and a lot of leaves that are going to make it very difficult to control with post-emergence herbicides. So this summer, I was actually able to monitor one of the populations in Boone County fairly closely. I checked it about once a week, all the way through the summer through early August. And so the farmer was a great help in letting me do this. And I was able to actually keep these sorts of, we'll call them like square meters out in the field, and actually pluck out the emerged copperleaf every week. So I was able to get a really good idea of what kind of emergence we were seeing on a timescale basis through the summer. The first emergence of the Asian copperleaf was noted on May 14th, and the farmer followed his typical herbicide program, except in the case that this summer he really wanted to try to get better control of that Asian copperleaf, and so he actually came back with a second post-emergence application, which he normally does not do. So just to show you, right, the first emergence was noted on May 14th, and on July 3rd, you can see some more seedlings there with those distinct round cotyledons still emerging. And on July 10th, you can see that that ground is fairly well shaded and they are still emerging. And on July 25th, at that point, we had pretty much halted emergence for the summer, but you can see that by July 25th, we are just now starting to see those bracts show up on the more mature Asian copperleaf plants. And so I'd like to provide you the visual graphic of what this emergence looked like through the summer. And so I measured it across 6 square meters in this field in an area of known Asian copperleaf populations. And what I'm going to present is the average emergence of the copperleaf across those 6 square meters on a weekly basis. On my graphic, I also have the rainfall from the preceding 7 days or so. Basically, the rainfall from the last time I counted up until the most recent time I counted. And so you can see here that that emergence starts on May 14th, and it very quickly peaks after that over the next several weeks. And actually, shortly after his first post-emergence application, noted with that vertical red line there, that would have been about May 30th or so, we actually reached 50% emergence on the population at about June 4th. But you can see we still have 50% of that population emerging after June 4th, long after our crop has been planted, and even through when it is in the process of canopying. So we actually had peaks later in the summer that seemed to very closely follow rainfall events. Well, what happens the rest of the summer? Those Asian copperleaf, they still continue to emerge very long into the summer, much like water hemp populations that we're dealing with. They tolerate shade well, and so, of course, eventually some of these plants are able to produce seed. What's really impressive with these plants is they have very low apparent seed production on a per plant basis. You can see that picture there on the left actually shows the comparison of a plant that was in basically full sun compared with one that was growing underneath the soybean canopy in a field. A very little difference in overall plant height, but you can see the one in full sun is much more branched, and it produced only about twice as much seed as that plant that only has one long stem. And you can see in the right there the image of the seed. They are very small. They're quite a bit bigger than water hemp seed, but I would equate them kind of with the size of like a turnip. It does survive well underneath in, shaded canopies, but it doesn't thrive. You can see here this picture on the left in this on this slide is a picture of a very small Asian copperleaf plant that I pulled out from underneath a corn canopy. This picture would have been taken in September. That plant had about 15 seed on it. The plant, in comparison there in full sun with lots of bracts and many seed contained on that entire plant, probably is producing seed somewhere in the low hundreds. So it will produce a lot more seed, but these populations are very low. That makes it even more impressive when we see scenes like this at the end of the growing season, where you can see sheerly how many plants there are in these fields. So, obviously, even with very low seed production, we are letting a lot of these plants through in some of these fields. The picture on the left there shows after a frost, actually, so you can see through the low lying area of that field, all of that part that looks basically black. Those are frosted off Asian copperleaf plants. The picture on the right, obviously, is what was left after the combine went through the field and harvested those soybeans right down the center of the row. A lot of Asian copperleaf. And then, even in some of these fields where farmers really focused on trying to manage Asian copperleaf this year, we still saw pretty substantial populations in parts of the field at harvest. You can see how much green there is underneath the canopy of these mature soybeans. So, what are the future steps? Well, this species has a reported seed longevity of about 4 to 5 years or so. That would be right in line with some of the other broadleaf species that we deal with here in Iowa, right? Water hemp, we would see probably fairly similar seed longevity from, but there is a lot of things that we don't know. So we need the ability to do some research on this species. We need to monitor these populations and try and figure out what's working well for managing it. So instead of just making recommendations based off what works well on other copperleaf species, we can make really good, solid management recommendations for this species itself. And then, if you are aware of any Asian copperleaf populations, if you see this video and you think, "Hey, I think I've seen that weed out in the field," please, if you have any photos of it from the growing season, report it via this link or the QR code. You can also report it directly to me at my contact information on the next slide. But this reporting is really important so we get a good idea of where it's located in the state and perhaps can figure out why it's here and maybe how to stop its spread. So thank you for your attention today. Again, my name's Megan Anderson. I'm an extension field agronomist with Iowa State. And please, if you do see Asian copperleaf out on the landscape, if you're aware of populations in any fields, please let us know either via that reporting link that I shared or via my contact information. Thanks for listening today.